Welcome to the Clock Tower. I'm Brandon, and today we're looking at Data Live. With Volume 2 now out, I wanted to dive into what the deck looks like going forward. So this is my interpretation of some of the deck coming out, the Unit 8 standby build. Very similar to the old build, a couple of changes, and a couple of unique profiles that are more unique to mine. And I'll kind of break down some of the different options that we can have with this deck as well. Things to be aware of as going forward. First off, I'm going to do an overview of how the deck plays, and then break that down level by level. Overall, the most important pieces for this deck are obviously the top end, the level 3 Kermi that has a limit of 2. Because that is only able to be dual laned, I pair this off with the Icy Tail here, so we have both of these cards in play ready to go. What's really nice with the Icy Tail is that it solves a couple different things at once. When you play this down, you can look up to 3 cards at the top of your deck, rearrange them so you can kind of choose your triggers, and you get to bounce one of your opponent's characters. So you can clear up a lane. You have a little bit more versatility in how you're attacking because you know what your damage is going to be. It also comes with an Icy Tail. It's pay 1, clock yourself 1 from Waiting Room, so it doesn't even have an additional hand cost. So 7 stock total to Tri-Field and Icy Tail, and that's if you Icy Tail first, which you probably want to do anyway for tying in with the Shuffle Back with the Kermi. It allows you a little bit more information with the Icy Tail first, so 7 stock to be able to just play them all from hand. But you're playing standby, you could standby them out early. The biggest part of this deck is being very careful and aware of where your 3-2 Kermi is. To get there and to get to the endgame board setup, what really helps propel that is the mid-game here. And the mid-game looks like this 2-2 Kermi from the new set that has Twin Drive. It sits a little bit smaller defensively, but it also has Encore. The reason this works really well is it pairs with the 1-0 Coterie that allows the assist, puts it up to 10, and on attack, when you trigger Soul, you can get 2k power to something. So you could potentially power up itself or something else. So sitting at 10 with the potential to become 14 on a single turn, because it's based on number of Soul triggers, right? Because it has Twin Drive, you can trigger twice, you can potentially trigger 2 Soul triggers, you can pump it up to 14 in a single lane, or power up something else. Very impactful, and keep your characters around with Encore to potentially scale over them again on the following turn. So you're very much board wiping every turn, very much playing that offensive game with Dal, as opposed to the more defensive game that you used to play. Still wanting to keep some of those defensive tools in, I also throw in the Spring Moment Yoshino. It's on the choose one of 3 list between the Brainstormer and the defensive Scry. This is probably the most unique part of this one. I really like the Yoshino ability and the ability to mess with board game states in the mid game. I think this has a really effective use and a very effective opportunity here to play both defensive and offensive with the triggers here. So if you're winning lanes, you could power this up as well. So you can kind of potentially win board with this in the front row. Obviously, you want the 2-2s to continue to push Soul, continue to be big in the front row, but this allows you answers to the opponent's early plays and forces them to make decisions and rearrange how they play the game. So I think it's very much a board controlling piece that is worthwhile running. Level 1 is very similar. Notably, I don't run the 7-5 typical standby target here. I run the Unreversible and the Yoshino here. So between the two of them, that's kind of what the board game at 1 looks like. In part because there's a lot of things coming out that are going to be pretty heavy into 2 or level 2s at 1. And because of the back row piece that can potentially power these things up. Yoshino sitting at 4-4-5 with the back row piece to also potentially become like 6-5-7, 8-5. 8-5 is a really good number, and because the Unreversible has pretty niche opportunities here. It also could be power pumped over as well, so it can step over 1-1 targets with the different Soul triggers. And because we run a lot of Soul triggers because of Dal and Standby, this is a pretty effective level 1 game for me. So looking at this deck overall, looking at level 0 and kind of working our way up. At 0, we run the new Kermi Ricky. When it becomes reversed, you can clock yourself from the top card of deck, mill 2, salvage equal to the level of those cards combined. So essentially a stock-free way to be able to push yourself a little bit further and try to get to 1 faster, get cards into hand without having to pay stock for it. Essentially can replace itself in hand and do it without paying stock, which is really great because we're going to have a pretty significant stock cost at 1. So being able to cut cost there is immense. We also run the new Center Runner. If you have 5 or more cards in hand, it gets 2k power, so it sits at 3-5 and can run to the center lane. This is a big card at 0. Pair this in with the power pump in the back row, you're sitting at a 4K defensively. And a 4K defensive center runner, I think, is actually a pretty powerful tool, especially coming into with some things that are coming out. So having that potential 4K just kind of sitting there if you're able to stand by in the 1-0. Not that that's your initial target, but being able to do that is a really cool play. From previous sets, we have the Shido Itsuka. This is our Blink. This is also our Pay 1. Send itself to Waiting Room. Look at the top 4, choose character, add it to hand. So one of the big pieces here is that I do not have a lot of mill pieces with this deck. That is intentional a little bit because of the lack of the Brainstorm. The Brainstorm would kind of be that same spot, and that's what many people choose to use this for the choose 1 of 3 is the Brainstorm that can bounce back to hand. So again, more cards to hand and then be able to help mill a little bit further and open up a standby lane. I really value that Yoshino, and so that's why I don't run the Brainstormer. Could you run a different Brainstormer? Absolutely. But all of a sudden you're running into slot problems. So I run the Shido Itsuka that can also essentially remove itself from field to change it out to the top 4 cards and add 1. A little less selective. I do also appreciate the Blink just for those kind of rogue matchups that have markers or have some kind of cross-turn power. But I also like the selectivity of them being able to look up to 4, so I can choose my deck state a little bit more efficiently that way. I do run one of the Happy Incoming Message Origami. This is our Climax swap, and then on play you can also potentially minus 500 power from your opponent's entire front row if you're just revealing your hand and have a Climax in it. It has the cool ability to remove 500 power, which can be pretty impactful depending on your opponent's game state is at 0, especially with a lot more tech pieces having that 500 power threshold. Being able to just kind of remove that is pretty helpful. Climax swap is important for the end game. It's not necessarily early, but that's what's the one of. So be able to get that into hand when you need it. I run 2 of the Chieri. Chieri is another helpful mill tool. If I don't have a standby target that I would prefer, and I don't have the board fully set up yet, I might stand by this out again for additional mill. There's also a little bit of hand filter as well. Help get some pieces into waiting room that way. On an offense at 0, it's actually pretty nice being able to give 1,000 power somewhere. So you can help power up some of your smaller characters to potentially win board against other opponents' tech pieces. So a very impactful card at 0 and potential mill throughout the game. Our last level 0 piece that really helps to round out the set is the TD Toka Confrontation with Humans. Look at the top card, if it's a character, add it, discard a card from hand, ditch a character to draw a card. This allows us to potentially draw into climaxes. This allows us to be able to filter potentially through 2 cards in our hand. Fantastic card to help get cards out of hand into waiting room, or to potentially draw into climaxes. So it does what you want it to do for the deck, and that's why it's also a 4 of, is because of the importance that getting climaxes to hand can be for this deck. So overall, that's the 0 lineup. There are only 15 zeros total, in part because we're running a little bit more heavy into the soul triggers at the top, but having these in play and having these ready to go as utility pieces throughout the game, super impactful. At level 1, we've seen a little bit of these cards that previewed earlier. We have the unreversible 1/1 that can't be reversed by cost 0 characters. And when your other character attacks, gets 1,000 power, so it can potentially at the last lane set up to 7. So when you're attacking with your smaller characters first that you probably want to stand by over anyway, this kind of gets more and more powerful to potentially step over things that it wouldn't originally at that point in time. And effectively, unless your opponent is playing standby or bringing things out early, this is probably going to live an additional turn to be able to get that board plus that you're looking for. It may not always win the lane power-wise, but it will win it offensive. It will win defensively if they aren't able to bring out a costed character at 0 or 1. We run the Spring Moment Yoshino as well. We have it's the pay 1 to swap around on board, and is an anti-change bomb that puts it at the bottom of their deck. So you're effectively removing things from field. Even if they had Encore, you're effectively controlling the board state from there. This can allow you to help force your opponent to side into it a little bit more often, keeping this character around, or even if they crash into it, you're able to remove their piece on their board and you're able to free lane to be able to swing into. So it's a pretty effective tool at what it does. Notably, this is our only blue fix for the deck. So if you want to play this from hand, you're going to need blue in your clock or level as well. This is kind of like my primary standby target that I'm looking for at 0, to be able to stand by that in, and then be able to hard play the 1/1 unreversibles on turn. Pairing with this, we also run the back row assist. That is a 500 power assist to front. You can rest it, give another character 500 power as well. And when you trigger a soul trigger, you choose a character to give 2,000 power to. Effective tool, you're going to want this in as early as possible in your back row and basically have it there the entire time. Rounding out our level 1s, we have the 102k backup. This allows us to potentially start winning board defensively as early as level 1. Being able to threaten this and help keep those power thresholds in check from your opponent is a pretty useful tool as well. Going into level 2, we run the 2-2 Kurumi, the new Kurumi, being able to get 1000 power for every other, so looking at 9-5 offensively and defensively. But it also comes with Twin Drive, pay 1, so you can trigger twice. Pairing with the 1-0 that we already looked at, could potentially go up to 14-5 if all power is situated in one spot. Potential board clearing card, very effective. Also, when you're pushing more triggers, you're pushing more standby, so you can potentially stand out even faster. It really helps to accelerate that game state starting at as early as 1 if you're able to stand by those in at 1. 14-5 is enough to be able to clear Alice when Alice comes out, so being able to start clearing lanes is going to be very impactful very quickly, so having that in play is going to be important for the deck. And that's kind of our mid-game strategy along with the free fresh counter. This allows us to be able to help control our deck state a little bit. So if we're not in quite the deck that we need to be, we can defensively use this and get all of our climaxes back into deck essentially to potentially continue to cancel more. This is very much an emergency out, but because you're winning board offensively, you have access to this tool, so having this tool in the deck is a very helpful answer to those cases. Looking at level 3, again we're looking at the 3-2 Inverse Toka. Being able to look at the top 3 cards of your deck, rearrange, put in any order, and being able to bounce a character on play. Effective tools to be able to help make your endgame as selective as possible, and help you know what your triggers are going to be, so you can kind of order your turn effectively. We also have then the Icy Tail attached with it, pay 1, clock yourself from Waiting Room to Icy Tail for 4. So it's a little bit smaller than the Icy Tail in yellow, but this is also on color, what we're looking for. It gives it a little bit cheaper, so you don't have to conserve as much stock for your end game. And it's also on attack, so you can do this even as early as 2, depending on the game state and situation of where you're at. From the original set, we have the back row 3-2 assist coterie, defensive 2k frontal assist, and well, offensively as well, but mainly looking at that 2k defensive assist is pretty good. Being able to play this from hand, we do run enough yellow that you can get that yellow into level by 3 to play this from hand to be able to potentially draw into your climax as well, or salvage a character that you need, so you're able to kind of use this effectively as well to be able to get the Kurumi that you need. So, since we have a limit of 2, this really helps you to dig a little bit deeper, get the pieces you need, or it can become a 1k1, so you can give 1000 power and a soul to all of your characters if you need to push a little bit more damage. So we have that utility right here with this card. And that's very much what Dal is, right? Dal is a utilitarian deck. So having the tools you need at the moments you need it, exactly what you're looking for here. We do run 2 of the early play. This is a healer essentially that allows us to be able to get that heal in. So we can kind of play a little bit more that slower mid game, if that's where we need to be. It's also in red, so right on color, on brand for what we're looking for. Rounding out our list, again, we're looking at the Terrible Spirit Kurumi. Fantastic card, being able to either stock swap, being able to shuffle back cards, or burn 3, and on play heal. Also sitting at 10-5, yeah, no, this card is a solid card in the deck. Obviously, this is what you're building towards. This is the point of playing standby, because you can effectively then control your opponent's state a little bit more to stick the damage you're looking to stick. Playing this card alongside of the others, exactly what you're looking for. Alternatives. There are a couple different ways that you can play this out, whether focusing a little bit more offensively or defensively. Looking a little bit more defensively, you're looking at having that Brainstormer in play. Instead of the Yoshino, you're looking a little bit more at teching in green. Quite a few people tend to go with the Negsol top-end event to be able to kind of play into the event a little bit more, being able to deny damage so you can play a little bit more of a 2-turn endgame. Essentially, being limited to 2 Kurumi is a big detriment, so trying to advantageously play into that is a big deal. With that, the Negsol counter is the biggest defensive tool Dal has to be able to try to prevent damage coming its way, so playing into that is a pretty effective strategy in that defensive role. Looking a little bit more offensively, kind of changing out the early play for the new early play, the Kaguya and Yuzuru early play, being able to bring that onto field. Small defensive power, so it's not going to really last across turn, but being able to get power on turn, potential burn at 2, and potential heal as well. So kind of depending on what you're trying to do, you're able to effectively pull that off just a tiny bit earlier. It's also a decent off-lane finisher as well. There's also another coterie from the first set that's also potential burn 1 as well that you can throw in as well, just kind of like another additional piece for that third lane. I went with the Icy Tail, but these help get those additional instances of damage off that would help to close out a game. The early play is probably the most effective with that additional burn 1, being an on-play burn 1, but also being a opportunity to get more choices out of a deck. Essentially, having that additional choice off of the early play makes that, I think, a little bit more of a better option there, especially if you are leaning more into that offensive build anyway. Outside of that, there's a couple other different pieces at 0 that you could run with the new stuff, being able to potentially do a little bit more mill, a little bit more filter, a little bit more opportunity here to be able to continue what you've already been doing. But this was the lineup that worked for me. This is the deck that I found through testing to be very effective at what it's trying to do. The big thing with this deck is it's going to run some struggles because the top end is limited too, right? You're not going to be able to as efficiently or effectively pull off double Kurumi without having to actively sculpt for it. Before when it was a 4 of, you could kind of not have to as actively sculpt for it. You could just randomly stand by these in and effectively start using it at 2. This one you have to be a bit more cautious with how often you're using these if you want it for a little bit more explosive endgame. Its reach is a little bit smaller because of that too. And so because its reach is smaller, you have to be very careful in delicating that balance, especially as we're seeing more and more explosive finishers come out, that getting your opponent to the right deck state and being in the right deck state yourself is very important with this deck. So playing to all of your outs is needed to make this very effective. With that, I expect we'll still see Dell, especially with a lot of board-based stuff, being able to step into and potentially remove board-based things is very important and very, very practical. With the power game being a bit more dependent on soul triggers, I don't know that we're going to see this topping as often as we'll see with some of the other things that can get their power more consistently. But we run 29 soul triggers in the deck, so hopefully that is enough to be able to efficiently get the power and get the triggers needed to push the damage to close the games. So this is the deck. Thanks so much for watching. We're going to have gameplay for this on Thursday and a Clock Talk next week. So thank you so much for joining with us. We'll catch you next time.